wanted to watch this meeting that Harris had with Zelensky. And the reason why is it's only 10 minutes long. We'll probably be able to watch the whole thing with no problem. But I saw some tweets and some, some clips of this that were getting shared around. And it seemed to be Harris's most forceful rhetoric in relation to the war so far. Her defining herself and contradicting, or not being contradicting, but becoming the opposite of the way that Trump's talking right now. Like, oh, this is all our fault, or at least the government's fault, our fault. This all could have been avoided if we just made a good deal with the Russians, and we need to stop supplying this. It's a black hole. Zelensky's taken $300 billion from America. It's a lie. It's like more than double, more than double what we've actually given. It's crazy. She is trying to not represent that, represent possibly the opposite of that, and be the one advocating for American influence in Europe, or just American influence on the war stage generally, but American influence in Europe, continued presence in Europe, continuing the NATO project, continuing to support our Ukrainian allies. And in this statement, since all we can really go off of if I'm trying to figure out her actual implementable policy positions is like, oh, let's go look at Philip Gordon. Let's go look at the people around her, the advisors. What did the national security advisor to Kamala Harris say about Syria back in the day? It's much better when it's straight out of the horse's mouth. And even though we're still not getting any specific policy differences, even if Harris disagreed with Biden on the long-range strikes, though, I doubt she would come out and say it publicly right now and undermine the president that she's going to be serving under until January. Doesn't make much sense for her to do that. So even if they do disagree, I doubt she's going to break with Biden right now. Then again, I will put this forward. Biden might remember on the issue of gay marriage breaking with Barack Obama and actually taking a more pro-gay marriage position in a public interview, which is inevitably, well, not inevitably, but then went on to push the Obama administration to be more forceful in favor of LGBT people, which then, assisted the fight for gay marriage rights and the acceptance of gay people in American public life. The VP breaking with the president on a few rare occasions, it does happen. I just don't think it's likely. But still, I'm using this as, I'm trying to listen to the winds, listen to the whistling of the winds to see how Harris is going to act on this, since, it's a close race. Good chance he'll be president. Let's check it out. Okay, let's skip straight to it. Oh my gosh, they're like the same height. And she's in heels too.
Everybody ready? Yeah. Well, President Zelensky, it is good to see you again. This is our 7th visit together, and welcome back to Washington, D.C. As I have made clear on our 6 previous meetings and throughout Putin's brutal aggression and war against Ukraine, my support for the people of Ukraine is unwavering. I've been proud to stand with Ukraine. I will continue to stand with Ukraine, and I will work to ensure Ukraine prevails in this war.
I will say, prevails. That's a word that sounds good, and it is a good word for supporting Ukraine. But prevails all depends upon how you define victory and what Harris means by victory, what the American position on Ukrainian victory is, because up to this point that has not been lockstep in tandem with the Ukrainian position to victory. But I just want to throw one last thing out there. The narrative that we're seeing currently is that Zelensky is in the United States to campaign for the Democrats. I disagree with it. I think it's totally unfair. When Zelensky was meeting with Donald Trump when he was president, and he was like, he wasn't throwing Donald Trump under the bus during like his scandals, during the calls. Trump should remember that, by the way. Zelensky didn't throw him under the bus. He said it was a perfect phone call. He was referring to it as perfectly fine because Zelensky knew that his country relied on the United States and even just the threat of America getting more involved in Ukraine. Like when Zelensky was meeting in Utah, none of that was political. Now he's in Pennsylvania meeting with the big ammunition factory, the biggest in the country, producing the most shells out of all the factories in America. Makes sense for him to visit it. Now it's political. I don't think that's fair, But him going here and standing next to her is going to just give them more ammunition. I'm not saying that it wasn't right. Of course, Zelensky should meet with somebody who is very likely going to be president. He should also be meeting with Trump, even if she should be more careful about what he lets out, what information he gives. But I'm just stating what's going to happen, because anything she says that's critical of, Donald Trump right now, or is trying to define her as a stark opponent of Trump, next to him, they're going to try to loop him in to say, it's a campaign stop. Even though Donald Trump, with a foreign leader campaigning for himself, that's just a Tuesday.
To be safe, secure, and prosperous, the United States must continue to fulfill our long-standing role of global leadership. We must stand with our allies and our partners. We must defend our democratic values and stand up to aggressors. And we must stand for international order, rules, and norms. Each one of these principles is at stake in Ukraine. And that is why Ukraine's fight matters to the people of America. The Ukrainian...
Okay, so her pitch on the Ukraine war is that the upholding of international norms when it comes to territorial boundaries, she didn't say territorial boundaries, but that's what I'm presuming, and, aggressive expansionist wars, it is of interest in the United States, because the more likely this is, the more common this is, the worse it is for the United States. She could have gone more into specifics, saying talking about American exports to Europe and how, economically intertwined we are, connecting it to the legacy of World War II and keeping up the tradition of trying to stop wide-scale war, expansionist war in Europe. I think that if you're talking about international norms, you should talk about the international norm around, nuclear non-proliferation and the sacrifice Ukraine made. Honestly speaking, one of the things that I've gotten the most positive responses from when talking to libertarians, when I go to libertarian conventions, because that happens on occasion, libertarians are, I think most are decent people, even if I disagree with them fervently on many issues. The thing that made the most impact in my experience of the people who I think would be the least receptive to these arguments was the fact that we made this agreement with them because we all agree that every country having nukes is not smart. And so we didn't want them selling these nukes, some corrupt general selling them to some terror group, or it not being well maintained, and we have a nuclear crisis in Europe, and then you have Chernobyl, then you have this new nuclear disaster. So we pushed them, and the Russians pushed them under the implicit threat of invasion to give up these nuclear weapons, and we made security guarantees. We need to maintain American credibility, and not only should we maintain American credibility when it comes to our commitments and our promises, there should also be a maintenance of credibility when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation. The answer cannot be to the world, you give up your nukes, then you get invaded, you get conquered, and you get subjugated, no matter what the commitments are, even from the most powerful country on the planet. It's not something that I would like to become the norm. So I think that, when you talk about international norms, it's nothing until you define why that norm's important. You need to explain the importance of these norms, because the idea of war is bad, that's a norm, I guess, but is it our job to keep that up? People might not know what these norms are, the importance of these norms. And so I'm hoping that Harris finds a way to communicate that more than just this very surface level analysis.
People are bravely...
But I mean, obviously this is not a place for her to ramble about it. I'm just saying that I think that we could sell this much better.
Defending their homes and their homeland, their freedom and their democracy against a brutal dictator. And the American people know well the meaning of freedom, of independence, and the importance of rule of law. These ideals are central to who we are as Americans. And some of the most important moments in our history have come when we stood up to aggressors like Putin, just as we must today. Indeed, standing with our friends and defending our ideals against tyranny has helped make America the most powerful and prosperous nation in the world. Putin's aggression is not only an attack on the people of Ukraine, it is also an attack on fundamental principles such as sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Okay, yeah, so she defines some of the specifics, but again, when you talk to Americans about something like this, one response you'll get often is okay, but who's going to invade Alaska? Now, you could point to Russian like aircraft getting very close to Alaska's like air defense identification zone, and you could, but you know, a Russian reconquest of Alaska is not happening, no matter what some Russian billionaires dream of in their you know, in their PJs at night. And so you need to define why that's bad to America. Why, I know this is silly, why all of like Europe being conquered or war in the European continent would hurt Americans. Because sometimes people will just leave the analysis at, that's far away, how does that affect me? And they don't realize exactly how globalized the world is. You know, you would think after the 2008 financial crisis, everybody and their grandma would know, like, oh wow, like a economic scandal in one corner of the globe can reverberate to every single corner. My goodness. And so if an economic crisis like that, a housing crisis can do that, or like a mismanaged housing market can do that, certainly a war on one of the wealthiest continents with some of the most capital in the world could do something economically destructive to the United States, to Europe, and the world. I mean, we have the data on a potential invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese, seeing like a 15 to 20% reduction in GDP for the United States. And, well, I know it was the worst for China, obviously even worse for Taiwan. It was something like negative 40%. But for the United States, it was demonstrably negative as well, like a 10% reduction. So, I think just connecting it to kitchen top issues, connecting it to the history that many Americans feel from their military service back during World War II today, connect it more to things that I think are valued by Americans than just vague international norms.
International rules and norms are not some abstract notion.
Oh, well, thank you, Harris.
International rules and norms are not some abstract notion. They provide order and stability in our world. They support American security and American prosperity.
Oh.
And when they are threatened anywhere, they are threatened everywhere.
That's not exactly what I wanted, but it's closer than I expected.
History has shown us, if we allow aggressors like Putin to take land with impunity, they keep going. And Putin could set his sights on Poland, the Baltic states, and other NATO allies. We also know that other would-be aggressors around the world are watching to see what happens in Ukraine.
By the way, like, we know of massive corruption scandals in Moldova. We know the Russians trying to buy out politicians. We know the Russians have troops already illegally stationed in Moldova, but nobody knows what Moldova is. Everyone knows what Poland is, okay? So it just never gets mentioned. It's also not a NATO ally, but, I mean, it's, like, between the two forces, Moldova would be the one that is probably one of the weakest points, and it's deeply ingrained with Romania, which is a NATO country, which could create a crisis. So, I mean, that's a hot spot that it gets very little attention, I think, when this is talked about, because, you know, most people don't know Moldova. So, like, mentioning Moldova as a country that could be invaded maybe doesn't catch as many eyes or catch as much attention as Poland or other NATO allies and such. But I do think it's one of the more likely scenarios if another war was to break out.
Ukraine. If Putin is allowed to win, they will become emboldened. And history reminds us, and history is so clear in reminding us, the United States cannot and should not isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. Isolation is not insulation. So then, the United States supports Ukraine not out of charity, but because it is in our strategic interest. We will continue to provide the security assistance Ukraine needs to succeed on the battlefield, as demonstrated by President Biden's significant announcement earlier today. I've been proud to work alongside President Biden and the 50-nation coalition we have built up to allow Ukraine to defend itself. Thanks to this coalition and the skill and the bravery of the Ukrainian people, along with your courageous leadership, President Zelensky, Ukraine has stood up to Russia's aggression, and today, Kyiv stands free and strong. President Zelensky, I am clear. Putin started this war, and he could end it tomorrow if he simply withdrew his troops from Ukraine's sovereign territory. Of course, he has demonstrated no intention of doing that. Instead, he continues to assault civilian infrastructure and terrorize the people of Ukraine. In Switzerland in June, along with 90 other nations at the Ukraine Peace Conference, I told you that the United States shares your vision for the end of this war, an end based on the will of the people of Ukraine.
Thank you so much for the 5 gifted, Jess Ogle. I appreciate the 5 memberships. When she says we share that village with you, that vision with you, Ukraine, that's closer to saying, hey, I'm with the Ukrainian perspective on ending the war. I'm with the Ukrainian perspective, and we're gonna hear stuff about territorial concessions in a moment that suggests to me that she takes the Ukrainian position much more seriously than Trump, but maybe even more seriously than Biden. I have this fear about Joe Biden, that Joe Biden has been, he was a chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. He was a ranking member for, I think we're talking like more than a decade. He served as VP for 2 terms. He's now served as president for a term. He's been doing foreign policy work for forever. I mean, you can go listen to his old speeches about the need to go intervene in Yugoslavia and stop the Serbians, etc. So I think when you get that much experience and you're like at the age of 82, you trust your judgment in a way that might make it much harder to shift you. And someone like Harris, who's new on the job, and might be more open to new ideas, might want to prove herself, she might be more willing to get more in their corner or take certain risks that Biden would not necessarily be willing to, just due to risk aversion that comes with decades of experience. And decades of experience, of course, in most situations are useful, but sometimes it can rust your initiative.
And the UN Charter. And that we must work with the international community to secure a just and lasting peace. And I told world leaders there, nothing about the end of this war can be decided without Ukraine.
Most important.
However, in candor, I share with you, Mr. President, there are some in my country who would instead force Ukraine to give up large parts of its sovereign territory. Who would demand that Ukraine accept neutrality and would require Ukraine to forego security relationships with other nations. These proposals are the same of those of Putin. And let us be clear, they are not proposals for peace. Instead, they are proposals for surrender.
It's a pretty strong condemnation of, to be quite frank, I think is maybe a direct reference to the J.D. Vance plan. I don't know if it's a direct reference to the J.D. Vance plan. It could just be a general reference to many people who have proposed something similar. For those of you who don't remember, J.D. Vance recently made the proposal that the current lines of the conflict should be frozen, leaving cities like Mariupol, much of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and of course the entirety of Crimea under Russian occupation, while also swearing off Ukrainian NATO membership, meaning that they would give up their land, the possible leverage that could come from NATO membership, for a ceasefire, and that there would be a demilitarized zone. So don't worry, because, if you're worried about what if the Russians invade again, don't worry, there'll be a demilitarized zone. Who would enforce it? Don't ask questions, okay? That's silly, okay? It'll go better than Minsk 1, okay? It'll go better than Minsk 2. Don't worry. But that was the proposal put forward by J.D. Vance. It could be a direct call out. It could be a call out to just a vague, swath of plans that are somewhat similar to that. But if you don't have the leverage of the alliance to stop a future invasion while signing off territory, what is being gained by the Ukrainians to justify the gigantic concessions you're asking them to make? And how would that not reward, egg on, and make the Russians and make them believe that they took the right path by invading Ukraine? Because they won. So why not invade them again if the Russians, as Putin says he believes, think they deserve all of it? That all of Ukraine doesn't really exist, that Ukraine is an artificial creation by the West, and it can only exist as a extension of Russia. And if it doesn't, then it cannot exist at all.
Which is dangerous and unacceptable. So President Zelensky, I look forward to our discussion today, and I will continue to work with you to ensure Ukraine prevails in this conflict and remains a free, democratic.
This is the most stone-faced I've seen Zelensky. I don't see him nodding. I don't see him shaking his head. I don't see him really visually reacting to anything she said so far, even though, again, this is probably the most vocally supportive I've seen her of you. She's been supportive of Ukraine. But this is the most vocal support I've seen. This is the most, the strongest rhetoric I've seen from him. He's not reacting. It might be because he's terrified of making this a scandal. He's terrified of making it seem like he's campaigning for her. And if he's nodding along like, oh yeah, she's right, then it might be seen, oh, look, see, it's campaigning. And so he's just being super PR brained right now. And he doesn't want to have another scandal. He doesn't want to make it more partisan than it has already become. But yeah, it's very stone-faced.
An independent nation. Welcome back again.
Thank you so much. Madam Vice President, thanks for the invitation. Happy to see you. Dear journalists, I want to especially thank you for your participation in the Peace Summit. And really, it was very important. And
Biden didn't come because he had a fundraiser, so they sent Harris.
We remember it. The format was successful. We are preparing the second one. And now we have to end this war. We need a just peace. And we must protect our people, Ukrainian families, Ukrainian children, and everyone from Putin's civil. And we are grateful to America for supporting Ukraine all along. And we'll have an important meeting today, right after I talk to President Biden about the plan of victory, and I will share some details of the plan with Vice President Harris. It's crucial for us to be fully understand.
What differences do you think there was between the victory plan that was showed to Harris and Trump? Because it's possible they were the exact same. It's possible that Biden got the one with the most declassification, and Harris and Trump, even though Harris is technically in office, got a lesser version because they're not in office. But there's no way they pitched it the same way. They got to know they're pitching to a different audience here. So I'm trying to imagine the differences in pitching the victory plan. I wonder if they're with Trump, Trump, we think that you can attain the victory that Biden couldn't. He wouldn't ever put that in writing. He'd say that in a room, with no mics, only him and probably some interpreters, just seeing if they can lean into the stuff that, honestly, maybe playing the same games that Xi and Putin plays with Trump. I'd be interested to see if Zelensky would try that.
And to work in a full coordination with the United States. And this morning I talked also to the congressmen, both chambers, both parties, and I'm thankful for the bipartisan support. We believe this war can be won and just peace can be closer only with the United States. Madam Vice President, this is our, you said, seventh meeting?
Seventh.
Yes, and not last. And the third meeting, as far as I remember, the third meeting this year.
Yes.
Thank you. And I want to inform you about the latest developments on the battlefield, of course, and about Ukraine's actions in the Kursk region, on what has been achieved and the ambitions ahead. Today we have a new strong support package, as you said, and we have common view on the things.
I wonder if Harris has any different perspective on the invasion of Kursk. Again, Harris has no room to really break with Biden as current serving VP. She just cannot undercut him. So it's really hard to try to detect if there's any differences. Not to mention, foreign policy was not the area she particularly strived in before she was VP. She was, he was doing prosecutor work, DA work, stuff in Cali. Not much of it was oriented around, I don't know, like the Syrian civil war or the war in Sudan or whatever.
That need to be done. We have to keep pressure on Russia to stop the war and to make truly lasting and just peace. It's a top priority for us and for other freedom-loving nations to achieve not a freezing, but real peace for us. So we need to keep sanctions against Russia strong, and we need to use the proceeds from immobilized Russian assets to protect Ukraine, our people, our cities, our front line from Russian evil. And of course, we must work hard to bring all Russian war criminals to justice. And one more thing, I want to inform Madam Vice President about the latest.
How does that
Russian
work,
missile.
actually? I'm trying to think of how that works in actuality. Because assuming that this war ends with the traditional, whatever that means, negotiation format, whether you're negotiating a complete Russian withdrawal, partial Russian withdrawal, ceasefire, whatever it is, how do you include that in any plan? Like, how do you get that from the Russians? I would just be super interested. Would it be that until you prosecute X, Y, and Z, we're going to keep sanctions on top of you until you do so? Because the Russians could leave the country but then refuse to prosecute war criminals because they don't want to disembowel themselves and humiliate themselves politically amongst the pro-war public, or those who were fighting the war, those with the most military experience, the soldiers who could say, you know, are stuffed full of trauma and probably resentment if the war is to fail. Already trauma. Already a lot of resentment, to be honest. Okay, they're going to be stuffed with that no matter what. I just think it's a hard pitch for somebody if it's still the Putin regime and there hasn't been a real change of face over there. Of course, it's something they still have to strive for. Maybe it will be picking up Russian war criminals decades after in countries that they vacation to in Spain and in Finland and etc. But I'm just interested to see how they would pursue that, and definitely in any negotiation. Or if they're just going to do what the Mossad did and they're just going to be assassinating people for decades after this.
And the Shahid's attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, we need...
The one thing I remember is that Russian general that got assassinated because his Fitwatch tracked his morning workout patterns, and so the Ukrainian military intelligence used it in order to pick a place and time to send an assassin to kill him during his morning jog. I could imagine them doing stuff like that for the next decade or two, especially if they can't actually get the war criminals. Yeah.
To urgently strengthen Ukraine's air defense to save thousands of lives and reduce Russian terror to zero. It's achievable. Thank you again. Thanks, America. Thanks to you, Madam Vice President. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you.
She didn't respond with Herum Slava, Batko nash bandera, Ukraina ma. I really thought Harris was going to open that up today. She was about to say, you know what, President Zelensky, I was listening to the polls on the Volyn massacre, and I agree that she takes out this, boom, let's go into a real history of Stepan Bandera. She rolls out the red and black behind her, some Azov boys come out. Harris' campaign takes a major shift. Okay, where are we? That's enough of this.